Welcome everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Gus Reinfelds. Today we will be speaking on how vertical farming can play an important role in addressing issues related to food safety, food waste and food security, and how the COVID-19 pandemic is not only making a lot clearer, but also is creating opportunities for indoor farming businesses. The webinar today is divided into two parts. After the introductions, first we will look at practical examples of indoor farming businesses that are dealing with the new realities of the pandemic, COVID-19, and finding practical solutions. And after that also, Henry Gordon-Smith will be hosting a panel discussion on food safety, food waste, and food security. My name is Gus Reinfelds. I'm the chairman of FarmTech Society, and I'm the moderator for the first part of this webinar. I'm joined here by Henry Gordon-Smith, CEO of Architecture, and by Mariska Dreschler, who directs the organizing team of GreenTech. Hi Mariska, I'm seeing you're popping up on the screen here. Great to see you.
Hello.
Can you please give the audience a short introduction and explain how GreenTech is dealing with the impact of the pandemic?
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for your presence here at this GreenTech talk organized together with FarmTech Society and Agritecture. As we know, we just cannot replace the great experience of GreenTech as a physical platform with approximately 500 exhibitors and 13,500 expected visitors from 115 countries. But we can reach out to you via this medium. And although it is getting quite crowded at the highway of online webinars, I'm so glad you to turn to us and find the time to be connected with us. You are part of our GreenTech community, and we very much would like to thank you for that. I am Mariska Dreschler, Director Horticulture GreenTech. Up from the beginning of GreenTech in 2014, we plan to be your connector the whole year round. So next to the physical events, like via our talk shows, our newsletters, the marketplace, live streaming of our summits, etc. And now with COVID-19 hitting us, our online tools are actually the only gateway to reach you. This is the second day of what should be GreenTech in Amsterdam. These 3 days, we want to offer you 3 great moments that focus on your profession. Yesterday, together with Wageningen University and Research, the winners of the second Autonomous Greenhouse Challenge were revealed. Team Automatos, I would like to congratulate you. Tomorrow, we dive into the world of medicinal cannabis. Is it still a green rush? And how to optimize your crop. But let's focus on today's webinar. And before we do that, Gus, I'm very interested who we have as an audience. Shall we have a look? Who is present?
Let's take a look. I think we'll have a poll popping up right now. In the meantime, I think as we're looking for who's here today, I think we're at a little over, well, almost 350 people and counting have joined the event. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background of people that you have registered for the event?
Yes, well, we have about, at least 2,000 people that have registered for our 3 webinars overall from more than 100 countries. So that's really impressive. And about this webinar, we have a top 5 countries: Netherlands, Mexico, USA, UK, and even also India. But I'm curious on who we have in the audience right now divided in the regions.
Okay, so, I think we have the poll results right here. And right now we're seeing that 2/3 of people are from Europe. And then we have North America as a second. And then we see good numbers of people from Asia, from South America, and from Africa and the Middle East. Wonderful.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. And now we would like to know what type of visitors we have in our midst. So let's have a look at that.
That's the second poll. Please all fill it in. Go ahead.
Well, normally we see that GreenTech has 3 types of visitors: growers, investors, and business to business. But I'm curious on how it will be divided right now in the audience. And Gus, what is the normal vertical farming visitor?
Well, what you would expect for vertical farming is, of course, it's a new type of business which is new to horticulture. So you will get a little bit more of a diverse audience, more spread out across the value chain. So in addition to growers, we also expect people from other parts, maybe from financing, maybe from technical companies, potentially from retail. So I'm quite eager to see who's here today.
Well, let's see. Well, does it measure with what you just said? What you expected?
Sort of. Unfortunately, I was hoping for slightly more retail people, but otherwise, I think it's what you could expect more or less. We have growers, technical people, people from education, very welcome as well. And of course, a significant group also who are others. And I'm of course very curious to know who they are, but that we will find out some other time.
Of course, and that's why we have the survey. So that's important to fill that in later on by the audience. But well, I would like to give you the online floor.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yep, everyone, thank you for providing your inputs. We will do this more along the way, so this was also just to get you started a little bit. I'll give you a short introduction about myself and the FarmTech Society. Today's event is a co-hosted event with FarmTech Society, GreenTech and Agriculture. And FarmTech Society is an industry association for the controlled environment agriculture industry. The growing sector that we're in needs an open, transparent and member-driven association that can unite and support a wide diversity of players in the industry. And FarmTech Society is that association, and we represent the full value chain from seed to supermarket, as the impact of new farming technologies affects the entire value chain, as we just also discussed in the poll. After a little over a year, FTS has more than 50 members in over 17 countries and counting. And among our members are industry leaders like Priva, Rijkswaan, Infinite Acres, standards organizations such as Global Gap and TÜV Süd, and various universities. And together we hope that we can represent the industry in a good way. We are a pre-competitive association focusing on three main pillars in our efforts. First, we develop standards, helping to reduce any thresholds that are limiting the development of the industry. Another focus area is education for the sector, working with thought leaders and educational programs on both sides of the Atlantic and across Europe. And our third focus is policy development, as we are seeing that rules and regulations are not yet adapted to the new possibilities offered by controlled environment agriculture. We're making sure our industry is heard there where policies for farming are developed, helping to ensure that also new forms of farming can build on solid policies and a healthy legal framework. FarmTech Society is headquartered in Brussels, and we have a strong team in Europe and North America, and we're of course a proud partner of GreenTech, working with GreenTech to also during normal physical shows. If you believe that such an association is worthwhile, please join our website, look at our website, join us, become members, and together we can grow the industry. Thank you very much. And after that short commercial, with us today is also Henry Gordon-Smith, who is the CEO of Agritecture. Welcome, Henry. I see you popping up right now.
Hi, Gus.
A New York-based firm, works close together with farmers and other indoor farming companies and suppliers, also in current COVID-19 times. Henry, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and some examples of things that you see happening right now?
Thank you so much, Gus and Mariska. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, of course, to our audience. So as was mentioned, I'm the CEO of Agritecture. Agritecture is a global urban agriculture consulting firm, and the vast majority of the projects we help plan for our clients, which are typically entrepreneurs, are indoor vertical farms. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually provide some different case studies of how vertical farms and vertical farming companies are adapting. So let's go over to New York City first with Farm One, which is Manhattan's first commercial vertical farm. So this is a small scale vertical farm serving high-end restaurants in Manhattan, one of the most expensive places on earth. So as you can imagine, when COVID-19 hit and the restaurants closed down, Farm One had to really pivot away from its typical provisions to these restaurants. And so how did they do that? Well, one of the things they did that was really interesting is they actually turned their farm, which does often host tours, into a virtual experience for their customers, specifically to target consumers at home they want to provide product with. So they created live shows and concerts in the farm that were live streamed. They also did virtual tasting tours where different chefs go through the farm and online they taste the products. And they also actually had a mixologist, someone who makes kind of drinks and combines them together. And they did that in a way that they could sell a specialized box so that when you're at home on lockdown, you can also have some beautiful edible flowers and herbs in your drinks. And they changed to contactless pickup. So I just want to remind you all that if you have questions about this part of the panel, at any time, you can enter your questions into the Q&A section. Now, Farm One is an example of how vertical farms can adapt in certain ways because they have a unique connection, especially when they're small like Farm One is, to the consumers in the city. They're very close. So they can connect to them in a really interesting way and pivot in a very interesting way. So let's move on to the next example, also in New York, but this time Square Roots in Brooklyn. So Square Roots typically provides product to various grocers. Some of them are small, but also restaurants. And so they really had to amplify their supply to groceries as essential services. This is one of the main things that they did. They also had excess waste as demand shifted. And so one of the things they did to adapt was to donate that. Now that may not be an economic solution to the problems, but it certainly does help with your PR and help with keeping your customers engaged in your brand. They also rapidly advanced their protective materials that the farmers had to use and moved to very strict food safety measures, even beyond what they already had. One of the things I talked to Square Roots' CEO about was that they were able to shut down some of the containers that they use for vertical farming to make sure that they weren't spending energy unnecessarily. So in some ways, vertical farming allows you to adapt in an interesting way by deciding how much you want to produce versus not, that may be sometimes difficult for conventional growers. Let's move over to Inno3B, which is a Canada-based turnkey vertical farming provider. So this isn't an operator, but they actually provide turnkey vertical farming technologies. And so one of the first things they did was they knew that there was going to be maybe a slowdown in individuals purchasing their equipment, entrepreneurs for food production, but they went directly and partnered with some of the biopharmaceutical companies trying to do research and R&D around COVID-19. So vertical farming as an ultimate control solution of the variables for plant production has a unique ability to grow some of these biopharmaceutical products. And so in that way, they were able to quickly jump on the opportunity that is COVID-19 and supply solutions there. And so I invite you to learn more about what they're doing with that biopharmaceutical company to help COVID-19 patients and first responders. Let's move over to Infarm, which is based out of Berlin, Germany, but they are a global company. And so what Infarm has is a model that's very focused on retail. And I think that there's been a lot of criticism of retail-focused models in some ways. You know, how can you have these systems in the store and the additional cost of production with that? Is that going to make sense? Well, in some ways, because Infarm really bet on the retail experience, they actually didn't have any losses as a result of COVID-19, but saw a dramatic increase in sales when speaking to their team. I learned a little bit about that. So as more consumers went to the supermarkets, they actually got more exposure from COVID-19, were able to do that. Of course, in order to provide a safe experience with these stands, Infarm has had to make sure that food safety and protective social distancing initiatives are implemented. So really interesting there to see what are the business models that these vertical farms have chosen and how the technology plays a role in that as well. And I think with Infarm, because of the increased interest in healthy products, it's going to be important that the consumers are more aware of things like herbs and fresh greens. And because Infarm has the front-facing access to the consumer, it gave them a competitive advantage in this challenge. Let's move over to Belgium and Urban Harvest, which is a Farm Tech Society member actually, and a very interesting vertical farm practicing circular economy activities. So again, going back to the modularity of vertical farming, Urban Harvest claims that they were able to actually increase production rapidly to respond to the increased demand from their retail customers. And so through these modular solutions, they can kind of increase and decrease their production, which is very interesting. And of course, they've provided different approaches to packaging as well to ensure that they're still being sustainable and reducing plastic where possible, which is something that's always been important to them. And they're supplying about 10,000 specialty herbs through their vertical farm weekly, which is quite interesting. So I definitely invite you to check them out as well. If you have any questions about these facilities or about vertical farming in particular, now is the question time for this part of the topic. So let's dive into your questions. So let me see, we've got some questions coming in here. So one of the questions is for me, particularly from Juan Gabriel. Do you provide all technology or do you choose from different technological solutions for our project? So I think that's more of a question about how agritecture works, which is welcome. So what agritecture does is we remain technology agnostic. We believe that there are a number of solutions to your problem, whether that's your labor context, your market context. And so we don't want to limit ourselves to any single technologies for our clients. And we remain independent and do kind of assessments of those different aspects to help you understand that. Let me just go briefly into an example of something that agritecture is doing to help you make some of these choices. Agritecture has taken its services of feasibility studies and put them online in a platform called Agritecture Designer. Agritecture Designer is the first online farm planning software for greenhouses and vertical farms and container farms. And its real mission is to help you at a low cost understand the yields and economics of your idea. Without hiring a consultant or going to a technology provider, you can get your initial estimates. And there's actually free parts of the tool where you can fill in a concept survey and kind of get an idea of similar farms to your idea. So let's go into this. I really want to add some value to you today by showing some data from our first users on Agritecture Designer. So if we look here at the first chart, one of the questions that we ask users is, what would you like to grow? And here in the answers, we can see some things that are not surprising. Most of the users want to grow leafy greens and herbs and microgreens, which I think shows a signal that the basic knowledge of what's possible in indoor farms has become quite popular, and also that they're interested in those products. But if we go a little bit further, we do see that there is quite a significant interest in berries and mushrooms. And so certainly if we think about GreenTech and the future of that event, there's going to be an increased focus on berries and mushrooms. Mushrooms can be grown indoors, they typically are. Berries are a hot new topic for vertical farming, as something different from the previous products I mentioned. Now, where are our users from so far? Well, certainly Agritecture's audience is global. We do have the majority of our audience from North America, but it is really expanding around the world in Asia, the Middle East, and India as well. But we can see here that most of the users were from North America that use the platform, followed by Europe and Asia. And you can see the other country breakdowns there as well. Vertical farming is truly a global phenomenon, as demonstrated by our audience here today. And I'd like to get into some questions and answers. If you want to learn more about Agritecture Designer, go to design.agritecture.com. So let's get into some questions here. Our first question here is coming from, this is a question about the unit economic study for setup cost and ROI of vertical farms. I think I answered that. That is possible with Agritecture Designer as a solution. You can also look at some academic studies, although they have some flaws as their commercial aspects. And certainly some equipment providers do provide some ROI estimates for them as well. Let's move over to Prashanath, who's asking, the type of crops in vertical farming is limited. What is Inno3B doing differently that addresses pharma needs? I invite you to read the press release on Inno3B. It's going to give you some details on what they're doing. But actually, historically, vertical farming has been used for medicinal products. If you look at a project actually in College Station, Texas, they are growing vaccines, and they were growing vaccines in tobacco plants, because tobacco plants can actually produce those vaccines more than the production in eggs, which is more typical. So I think it's about identifying how these controls around vertical farming can impact pharma as well. Certainly the theory is that in a controlled environment, you can increase the usable biomass that would be used for medicinal or pharmaceutical uses. Let's go into another question here. From Francis Beaumont, we've mentioned positive adaptive changes. What are some of the negative adaptations or scenarios that have panned out due to the pandemic? Well, I think as mentioned in the examples I gave, most vertical farmers have suffered from a shift in either increased demand they have to respond to rapidly, with the difficulty of keeping their labor safe through the aspects of getting to work and being safe on the job. So that's a challenge, I think, across the board. We're going to get a little bit into that with our panel as well. I think some of the other negative ones are, if you're focused on restaurants, you had a dramatic loss in sales and a very difficult ability to respond to that, especially if you're small and you're far away from your consumer.
Okay. Hey, Henry.
Yeah.
We were seeing, I think, a good number of questions here. We also, I think I got some questions that I see coming in on.
Go for one if you want.
Yeah, no, right. So on for instance, the types of crops that are being grown from Daan de Vries. What share of leafy greens is delivering a more progressive city? I think in general, you would see that that vertical farming is, of course, still very much of a startup industry, and young industry, where the typical crops that are being grown is still leafy greens, herbs, maybe some microgreens or something like that. What you do see is that if you look about more progressive cities, people, I would say areas where people embrace the new ways of farming in a little bit more way. The typical crops you would see are the higher value added types of crops that are basically more nutritious or tastier or differentiating compared to what you would normally get. Clearly, it's one of the ways that we're looking as an industry to also develop business models that work. And also from the examples that Henry shared, You can see that some companies do a better job than others, and of course we like to also learn from the good ones, and that's also what we're doing in this event. I think we cannot answer all the questions right now, so thank you everyone for putting them in, and we have recorded them, and we will come back to them as much as we can. But I would suggest that we move on to the second part of the webinar now. Henry, you will be picking that part up. You will be the moderator for that part. Can you tell me about the exciting panel that you've got lined up for us and how we're going to go into the next segment?
Absolutely. Thank you for those questions. And just a reminder that if you want to tweet at FarmTech Society, at Society Farm, or Agritecture at Agritecture, or at GreenTech Rye, you can actually tweet with us, and our social media managers will do our best to answer your questions on an ongoing basis. So let's move on to our panel. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about controlled environment agriculture, CEA as it's called, and how food safety, waste, and security relate to that in the wake of COVID-19, the wake of this global pandemic. And what we've done is we've gathered a global set of panelists from Canada to the United States and Africa to answer some of these questions to give some local context. So coming up first, we're going to start with Lauren Baker. And Lauren Baker is the Director of Programs at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. Lauren, how are you doing?
Great, Henry. How are you doing? Nice to be here, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much. So Lauren, just tell us about yourself and your work.
Great. I think my slide's going to come up any minute. I'm with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, and we're a strategic alliance of philanthropic foundations working together with others to transform global food systems now and for future generations. So this topic and this community of people is really great to connect with. Our vision is healthy, equitable, renewable, resilient, inclusive, diverse, and interconnected food and agriculture systems shaped by people, communities, and their institutions. And that long list of principles is really important to us, helps guide our work and evaluate our work as well as we think about food systems transformation. Here on the slide, I've just jotted down, if we change our objectives for the system, we change the system. And I think the COVID pandemic is really illustrating how food safety, food waste, food security, food insecurity are all intrinsically linked to aspects of our food systems. So fair and affordable access is really a pressing issue right now around the world. Poverty and injustice, as we've seen in the last 10 days. The availability of culturally relevant, appropriate food, weakened and compromised immune systems, environmental contamination, occupational hazards, and more. And so what we're interested in is really how these issues are symptoms and aspects of the broader food system. So we have a chance, and I think we'll be talking about this through the examples. And Henry, the examples you provided were really great illustrations of how we can shift from food systems that too often result in harm and that put human, animal, and ecological health at risk to food systems that put human, animal, and ecological health first. So really we're talking about broadening our frames of analysis, looking at the linkages, looking at key connections and opportunities for systemic action that reduce health risks in food systems. So to wrap up, I think we all know on this call today that there's a need for integrated approaches. This can happen at the policy level, but also within a company. And this is where CEA can make a meaningful difference as we seek to marry sustainability, health, and equity objectives in the post-COVID context. So look forward to fleshing out some of those ideas as we delve into the conversation. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for those insights and also showing the interconnectedness of it all and the complexity. We're going to dive deeper into food security and CEA with Lauren coming up in a bit. But first, let's go to Nana Ajoa, who is the initiator at Guza Kuza. Nana, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. I like the way you pronounce Guza Kuza.
Oh, how am I supposed to pronounce it? Tell me.
You got it.
Did I get it? I was trying to get it right.
That's perfect. So yes, Guza Kuza is an organization in Ghana, and we are focused on women. So we inspire women to take action in agribusiness. We believe that from the classroom to the farm or to the boardroom, women should be at the forefront. And so we train them, we equip them with skills and with resources. So far, we have initiated bold projects called Ignite and also She Farms. So for Ignite is an agribusiness initiative for young women on the African continent. So it's for all women on the continent. We provide them with mentorship, with internship, with residential training. So by the time they are done with the training, they can actually build their disruptive businesses. And then She Farms is also a climate smart revolution. We call it revolution because we want to stop the vegetable importation into our country. So this is for only Ghanaians, unfortunately. It's for Ghanaian women, and we are equipping them with skills, how they can be able to grow vegetables, how they can be able to do best practices, yes, in agriculture, and also build businesses that can withstand the test of times like COVID-19. Yeah, so basically that's what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Nana. And I really admire all your work in those examples. We're going to get into some of that adaptation to COVID-19 coming up soon. Let's move over to our next panelist who's joining us from the United States. Marnie Carlin is the Executive Director of the Controlled Environment Agriculture, again, CEA, Food Safety Coalition. How are you doing, Marnie?
I'm great, Henry. Thanks so much. And thank you, of course, to GreenTech, FarmTech Society, and Agritecture for having me here. It's so great to be a part of this conversation on the impact of COVID-19. And it's also so great, I just have to say, to be a part of a panel of such strong and amazing women. I just want to put a pin in that because I think that's pretty amazing. My name is Marnie Carlin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Controlled Environment Agriculture Food Safety Coalition. We are an independent and member-governed organization whose membership is made up of controlled environment leafy greens growers and turnkey solutions providers who subject their production processes to external food safety audit. We were established for a few reasons: to develop credible, strong, and appropriate food safety standards specific to CEA production, to educate consumers and regulators on controlled environment growing and its added values, and of course to communicate the value of CEA. And we advocate for policies in the United States that take into account CEA production and that ensure that CEA production is considered a vital part of our food supply. We'd love to talk to any of you who might be interested in learning more about what we do, and you can see our contact information here. But right now I'd like to talk for just a minute about how CEA production can be a part of a secure domestic food supply, and also how our approach to food safety creates confidence, especially in this time of pandemic. First, how CEA production can be a part of a secure domestic food supply. Controlled environment production is resilient to business disruptions. That's one of the great things about what we do, in part because we replace a long and complex supply chain with a shorter and more local one, which is less susceptible to these disruptions and is also more agile and able to pivot when disruptions happen. As Henry mentioned earlier when he gave those examples, we see lots of examples of CEA producers being able to pivot their operations. As the pandemic stresses our food supply chain, CEA producers can continue to supply the nation's consumers with healthy and safe food. And then of course, I'd also like to talk about how CEA food safety practices can create confidence in our food supply, especially at a time right now when we're having some lack of confidence in a variety of things that are going on. CEA producers, of course, always take food safety seriously, and we've been able to pivot to ensure that additional measures are being taken during this time of pandemic. Measures such as the use of personal protective equipment, distancing, grouping team members and rotating those groups so we can identify and segregate risks should they arise. I also want to quickly note that our focus on traceability in our production processes that we always do, regardless of pandemic or other disruption, is a benefit of CEA production generally. It allows us to trace when we do have potential food safety issues, and we can translate that now into traceability of our entire process, including what team members have been in contact, et cetera, which allows us to really respond very, very quickly and very well should there be any COVID issues. So it's been a real learning experience for CEA and a real opportunity for us to take the things that we do so well in a day-to-day environment and translate them into this, this significant pandemic situation.
I find this so fascinating, Marnie, because even before COVID-19, there were food safety outbreaks, E. coli, various issues that CEA started to really rise in interest to retailers and governments in the US to really be a solution. And now COVID-19 has kind of really amplified that. And so it's really good your coalition is in place right before this. So in the context of food safety, we're going to now move into some deeper dives here, and you're going to be one of the first people we talk to about food safety. But to help the audience kind of get up to speed a little bit, we're going to show a case study from Europe and some details of what's happening with food safety and COVID-19, specifically in the format of a video coming up here soon. So this video is essentially going to explain a little bit more about some of the food safety issues that are being faced in the face of COVID-19, and it's going to help us understand what's occurring there. Do we have the video ready? Great.
Spaniards call it the plastic sea. 33,000 hectares of greenhouses, even visible from outer space. This is where 50% of the fruit and vegetables consumed in Europe grow. But since coronavirus began ravaging Spain, production has become a challenge.
Everyone wears masks, gloves. To keep a safe distance between workers, we've set up separation barriers to better protect them.
Safety measures that have added 35% onto production costs, says the company.
Now you need to put a bit of gel on.
As soon as we arrive on site, we have our temperature taken. Our presence adds to the manager's stress. Her biggest nightmare is for one of her workers to be contaminated.
Of course we are continuing to work, but we need double the staff because we have to rotate everyone more. We produce the same amount as before, but with double the workers.
The extra costs drive up prices, but neither the producers nor the supermarkets want to give us precise figures.
We're producing peppers here, and we're in the middle of the harvest.
A few meters away from the packing factory, this agricultural engineer is proud to show us that production has never stopped.
Our job is to feed the world. It's for the common good, so yes, I'm proud to keep working in agriculture at a time like this.
One of the knock-on effects of the health crisis is that consumers want more fruit and vegetables than ever before.
We've seen a rise in demand for fruit and vegetables that improve our immune systems. Green peppers, for instance, have 3 times as much vitamin C in them than an orange. We just hope the rise lasts after the crisis.
With increased demand, this unionist complains some companies are breaking the rules.
Many companies are putting their profits first. They are not worrying about workers' safety, and that's a real problem.
In the fields, for instance, no one is wearing a mask. Majid, a Moroccan picker, tells us of his worries, out of the earshot of his bosses.
Of course we're afraid to go to work, because it's dangerous. There's some tasks that we do, and we shouldn't be doing them because of this deadly virus.
Majid thinks too few checks are being carried out. He believes workers in southern Europe are being abandoned.
Okay, thank you so much for watching that video with us. I think it really highlights the challenges around food safety and what's happening to these farms in COVID-19. Now, there was one of the questions we got from the audience, which was about CEA. CEA stands for Controlled Environment Agriculture. That's the use of greenhouses or even more high-tech vertical farms to control the variables of production. So one of the questions we're really trying to talk about here today is, does that control have a better response, an interesting response to the issues that have been highlighted because of COVID-19 in this crisis? So now we're going to open it up to our panel a little bit. I'm going to begin with Marnie. Marnie, one of the things that was mentioned in there is the difficulty of kind of managing staff in the face of COVID-19 and these rotations. Could you walk us through what are some of the things you're seeing CEA operators do in the context of COVID-19 that's different? What are some of the examples that you're seeing on the ground?
Absolutely, thanks Henry. And that was a great and very informative video. In the US, here in CEA production, we've seen shifts in safety measures as we've grown to understand how to mitigate the risks of COVID. We've seen our members commit to wearing personal protective equipment, so that's masks, gloves, face shields sometimes. We've seen our members limit access to the farms to only essential employees. and only essential employees, right? So only those who are necessary to be farming at that time, right? We've seen our members take temperatures before employees enter, which we know is a limited, limited test, but it's something. And of course, we've also seen our members rotate teams of employees like you saw in the video. So if there does become someone with an exposure, you're able to then sort of trace any risks and segregate them from the process. Like I said earlier, CEA production does already incorporate a lot of these traceability measures in growing. So this has been an opportunity to take what we already know and implement it in slightly different ways to respond to the pandemic. I did want to comment very quickly that in the video, someone did mention that it's a stress on the system sometimes to implement these measures, right? It does increase some costs. But a couple of things. We have been seeing in the US a rise in demand for fruit and vegetables as well. We've also been seeing a rise in the supply of available workers, right? As we've seen a number of industries really take some harm, like the restaurant industry is an example, it's been an opportunity to offer jobs, to offer work to folks who love the food sector, right? And so who are available to do this work. And of course, regardless of all of that, it's critical to adhere to these measures for a couple of reasons: to protect our workers and to ensure a safe and secure food supply for our consumers.
Well, that's very interesting to hear that you've seen the demand also increase in the United States. And I really like that comment about the movement of unemployment to these farms, because when we're thinking about vertical farming in particular, they tend to be very close to the cities. And I imagine a lot of those jobs that are being lost are in urban areas where the majority of the restaurants are. And some of those food management skills that we see in restaurants do translate. Would you agree they translate to CEA? So if you know food safety handling in a restaurant, do you think you have at least some baseline for a greenhouse or a vertical farm, Marnie?
Absolutely, absolutely. Some of those safety trainings transfer, and of course the passion for what we do and the passion for bringing healthy food to people, which is always, I always say that you can't teach the passion, right? So that's the piece that you really want.
Yeah, and we saw in the video too, right? Those employees and the manager really cared about their work, which is to feed the world. Nana, could you tell us, what are you seeing on the ground, and kind of tell us about your work and what's going on with food safety and what CEA work you're doing there as well in that context?
Okay, so with regards to food safety, I think we are still lagging behind a bit. But because of COVID, there has been gradual awareness by non-for-profits, by government agencies in many rural farming communities. However, aside the advisory on regular hand washing and provision of buckets and water and soap, there has actually not been any pragmatic step regarding sanitary practices on the farm actually. I don't know whether you know about this. Ghana have had issues with phytosanitary practices on food handling. So I think 2 years back, our vegetables and most of our produce were actually banned. So like I said, it's actually a gradual process. And I always tell people that COVID has really been a great lesson for us, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa. So we are now getting used to, and we are now also learning how we can actually get all these stuff, especially with the food safety and food handling, especially on the farm. We are not there yet, but I hope we will get there soon.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Nana. I'm going to go on to Lauren in a moment, but I wanted to kind of follow up a little bit. Do you see, so COVID, in a place where there's maybe a less knowledge of food safety practices, traditionally in agriculture, as you mentioned, is COVID-19 an accelerator of that knowledge because they kind of are forced to respond? Do you see that people are talking about it more because it's really to protect the workers themselves? Do you think that food safety practices will increase now in Ghana as a result of COVID-19?
Yes, that's what I said earlier. So because of COVID has been an eye-opener. Yeah. So now people are getting to know the effects. So people are being cautious because of COVID, and people are now thinking about the health of their employees, the health of the food we eat, and are taking measures to handle our food safely.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Lauren, do you have more to add to this topic? I'd love to hear from you on the global context and what you're seeing, food safety around the world in your work.
Sure, just a couple of quick points to build on Nana and Marnie's great interventions. Absolutely, this experience of COVID-19 has been a real eye-opener, and I think a learning experience for everyone. My example, the example that comes to mind is really a Canadian example, Loofah Farms in Montreal. And I happened to be traveling in Montreal when the pandemic hit, and Loofah was providing updates to their customers from March 12th onward. Really, March 12th, there was just a whisper of the lockdown in Quebec, where they're based, and really have implemented, like Marnie described in detail, these dramatic changes to their practices, their handling, their delivery, all in the context of this incredible, unprecedented demand. So really adaptive behavior in the most real sense. And throughout May, it's really interesting. They prepared to open their 4th greenhouse, which is going to be the largest rooftop greenhouse in the world, apparently. So all of this as they were sort of like, launching a whole new aspect of their business. So I think it's a really great example of both what Nano and Marnie described, this kind of incredible passion, and then also this adaptive adjustment in terms of pivoting to meet the local context. And it's great to see that sort of flexibility in business models as we face the pandemic and think about resilience in the future overall in the global food supply system.
Thank you, Lauren. We're getting some incredible questions from the audience, and I want to thank you all for sending them in. I'm going to try and bring them into this panel as it relates to it as much as I can. So one of the things I want to talk about next relates to a little bit on your work, Marnie. There's a lot of talk in CEA and vertical farming about automation, right? We have this vision of high-tech automated vertical farms that don't need any labor in the future. Now, I don't think we're there yet. I think we can all agree we're in a kind of semi-automated middle ground. But what do you think? Do you think that automated greenhouses and automated vertical farms make those operators more resilient to crises like the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure, I think that they can, right? Because some of the business disruptions that come as a result of a COVID-19 pandemic or other issues are with regard to the labor market. But it's not just the automation, it's also in part the sort of type of labor. We do find in the US that CEA producers are a little insulated from some other labor sort of pressures on our labor system. One example is that earlier in the time of the pandemic, there were some moves by the federal government in the US to limit immigration and limit mobility in that way. And a lot of traditional farm workers in the US are migrant workers, right? And so holding separate any politics around the thoughts around immigration, that was something that CEA producers were relatively immune from. And that is an area that, even if it's not full automation, it's an area where the kind of work that we do has access to a different labor force.
That's very interesting when one is considering how they justify that upfront investment for something like automation and estimates risk. Nana, I want to go over to you for a moment. CEA, you talked about Ghana having food safety issues historically, and CEA can provide some protection in principle, and as we've discussed, can make farms more food safe. You obviously need the skills to also operate it properly. But can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges around such an equipment-heavy, capital-intensive type of agriculture in Ghana?
Yeah, so it's still a challenge because even to start with, let's say irrigation, just a simple irrigation, it's super difficult for an average Ghanaian farmer or average African farmer to get irrigated farm, right? That's why most of our farms are seasonal. So equipment, getting huge equipment on farm, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's kind of difficult right now. But just so to add that there are a lot of farmers, there are a lot of organizations, there are a lot of agencies who are trying to finance some of these things. So there are cooperatives also, and I've seen, and I've also worked with cooperatives that have actually pulled resources together to get some of these equipment. But on the average, it's not easy for an average farmer, yeah, to get all this equipment.
Very, very interesting, especially when we think about, sustainable development around the world, how the role of CEA and some of those challenges around equipment get solved in the long term to make that impact. I want to ask one last question to Lauren. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience about the nutrition in CEA farms, and there's actually very few studies. I've seen some individual farms, including Farm One, look at BRICS results, one of the nutrition studies for CEA. But I guess, we're seeing that COVID-19 is telling countries and informing countries to not only invest more in food security and localization of production, but also in the quality of that production, the nutrition in it. Are you seeing anything about that in the discussions? And what are your thoughts on CEA as a potentially more nutritious way of growing some crops in the face of COVID-19, maybe crops that improve your immunity, things like that? I mean, are we there yet? Is that part of the discussion? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, one example that comes to mind is just how, in terms of sort of nutrition and healthy food access, which I think is, the core of your question is, how do we, what is the sort of ecosystem in a neighborhood or in a region that can provide that food? And in my own neighborhood, I'll just give an example of how, of course, all the farmers markets were shut down, and local farming businesses, which include greenhouse businesses, were able again to pivot. So just back to this theme of pivoting to congregate through neighborhood food hubs that are not only servicing sort of middle-class customers, but also linking food bank clients to this healthy food like microgreens, seedling sprouts that are grown, in March, in April, in May, extremely healthy and nutritious to those food bank customers or clients who probably didn't have access to those fresh foods previously. So I think it's a great example of a couple of things. One is, those foods have high nutritional value, but also the importance of these networks that are able to respond really quickly to meet demand, to respond to kind of new vulnerable groups who are needy of who are really needing healthy access to healthy affordable food in a crisis moment.
It's such a great point about those networks, and again, I think that lends itself to talking about how urban farming networks in some ways have a competitive edge, because certainly in New York City, the urban farms connect with each other, they meet monthly, they have a relationship. And just to give one example, Teams for Food Justice, which has vertical farms in schools and produces that to impact food access, is now shut down. They can't produce it. So what did they do? They accessed their network organizations like Bowery Farming to get donations to make sure they can still supply those people in need with excess food that might have been wasted. So those networks actually are really valuable to reduce food waste, which is actually one of our next topics, but also to kind of see how that technology and those networks relate to this issue as well as we're talking about. So great answer, really love that. So next up, let's move into critical topic number 2, which is going to be about food waste. And to kick this off, we're going to ask a poll to our audience. So the poll question is, what is the approximate financial loss farms in the United States have experienced since March, since COVID-19? So you see some financial US dollar estimates there. You have about 15 seconds to answer that question. How much food waste since March has occurred, and what's the value of that? What's your guess? Give you a couple more seconds to answer that question. Okay, and now let's wrap up the poll and see the results of that. Okay, so we had 54% of our respondents actually seem to be quite informed, answered it correctly. 1.3 billion is the right answer, but we did have some interesting responses close to that. So quite a significant number considering it's only since March, and we do know that food waste already is an ongoing issue. So it's really quite this complicated thing, right? That we have we want more of this food, but we're actually having a lot of waste in this crisis. So again, signals that our system, it really has some room for improvement. So let's move on to the topic of food waste, and let's start with you, Nana. I have a question for you I'm going to pull up here. So a big part of the US farming industry that's taken a hit due to the shutdown is the food service industry, you know, these restaurants and related. In turn, a lot of food has been thrown away, some of it donated, as we mentioned, or it's been put back in the ground if it's soil-based in some cases. In what way has this kind of global shift of demand impacted food waste and agribusiness in sub-Saharan Africa? Pretty big question there, but really want to hear from you what's happened on the ground related to food waste and agribusiness, especially with the groups you're working with and your projects.
All right, thank you very much, Henry. So food waste, as we all know, is not new to the food industry. As a greater percentage of the food we grow in sub-Saharan Africa is never eaten anyway. However, the worsening issue of food waste due to this pandemic has thrown more light on the flaws present in our food supply chains. Usually farmers' biggest buyers are the food service industry. So talk of restaurants, talk of hotels. And during the pandemic, the guidelines forced many of these places to shut down their operations. So before lockdown in South Africa, one of our igniters, Peladi of African Agriculture Solutions, purchased thousands of seedlings for her hydroponic farms. Unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, her company is a regular supplier to major hotels and restaurants in Pretoria. But few weeks after she purchased this and started the farm, the lockdown announcement was made. So just like most of us, this unprecedented pandemic took her off guard, and she did not have any alternative market. She did not make plans for any alternative market. So because she knew she was gonna supply to the hotels and restaurants anyways. And unfortunately, the hotels couldn't buy from her. And so she had to stop the hydroponic and everything got wasted. So that's the example I'm giving from South Africa, from Pedali. And then I also have a second example from Ghana. You know, unlike the US, Ghana's food system has not been significantly impacted yet. I'm adding the yet because we don't know what's going to happen next. So for us, the real issue is low demand because of lack of purchasing power. You may agree with me that most of the people have lost their jobs, so the income of families have reduced or have decreased. And for us, we are still in the growing season also. So I give an example of Marian. Because of this decrease in income, Marian, who used to supply every day, she used to supply vegetables every day to households, could not do that anymore because they couldn't afford, right? Because most of them lost their jobs. So instead of every day, now she was delivering twice a week. And she had already purchased these produce. So the rest of the produce went wasted. So she lost them. And then I moved straight to Nigeria. We have one of our igniters there called Oluwa. For Oluwa stuff got stuck on the farm because she had harvested, and because of the lockdown guidelines, she couldn't transport from the rural area to the city. So she got stuck. I mean, her stuff got stuck, and she had to use the produce for mulching, you know. So COVID impacted them, I mean, hit them hard, but in different ways in terms of food waste, okay? But one thing I know is that most of these igniters, so this is the good news, though it's still food waste, most of the igniters also understand risk management, I mean, risk mitigation. So instead of letting this impact hit them, they rather use the lemonade, I mean, the lemons, COVID through at them to make lemonade, all right? So for example, Marjoa now created e-commerce because of COVID. She had an idea to create an e-commerce where she could sell to other people who couldn't go out to buy, right? So for me, I see COVID also as a blessing in disguise, because it has opened our eyes to so many things, to so many flaws, especially in the food supply, in even food waste, how we can use technology, how we can, and for Marianne, because she couldn't sell, now she has learned to add value to her produce, right? And for Olua is now trying to raise funds for cold chain. I'm sure if it had not been for COVID, she wouldn't even have thought about cold chain. So these are some of the things we are beginning to see because of COVID. And yeah, so these are
Thank you so much for those examples, Nana. Really, really interesting. And again, another signal that in other parts of the world, you know, and even in the developed world, COVID-19 is a wake-up call to us. Yep. and showing us and kind of pushing us to adapt and to respond. So I really appreciate those examples from 3 different countries. And I really liked your comment on risk mitigation and kind of that, how important that planning is. You know, if you have one plan, a plan A, as we say in the United States, and not a plan B, it's very difficult to respond. And you never know what's going to happen when you launch your business. And so I think some of the questions are, you know, is CEA more adaptable? Can you have a plan B? And, you know, one of the things about CEA facilities is you can actually have different methods of production to grow full plants or salad mixes and things like that, that I think in some ways make it adaptable. But we can discuss that in a little bit. Marnie, first of all, audience, if you have questions about food waste, now is the time to ask it. So please send those questions in. Marnie, does CEA reduce food waste inherently?
Inherently.
Boom.
Well, there's a big one. Thanks. You know, I'm gonna pivot a little, as we've been talking about pivoting throughout this entire, and I'll talk about the things that CEA can do to reduce food waste. I don't necessarily want to make an absolute statement.
Okay.
I went to law school many years ago, so I avoid the absolute statements. But I will say that there are a lot of things that CEA production does that mitigate food waste, right?
Okay.
And
like
Nana
what?
talked. I was just about to get there. No, it's good. Nana talked about a number that are just fascinating and really, to me, very interesting examples. What I'm seeing from my members in the US is a few things that we've talked a little bit about. We've seen members whose businesses sell into the food service supply chain, who have had the ability to pivot and enter the direct-to-consumer market if possible, or donate food if possible because there's needs there. We've seen, I thought your example, Henry, about what Bowery Farming, another member of ours, is doing was really exciting, and what a great way to ensure that those networks that we have, that we've built up maybe for other reasons, but can be put to use now to not only minimize food waste, but also ensure that folks have access to healthy food. Another example outside of COVID, perhaps, that I heard from one of our retail partners, or one of my members' retail partners, around how CEA can potentially limit food waste is that oftentimes CEA, the chain, but I keep talking about the supply chain, the chain between the CEA producer and the final destination is shorter, which will allow retailers or other consumers to purchase smaller amounts more regularly, right? So instead of food going bad on the shelf, instead of making one larger shipment for a longer period of time, they can really target their orders in a way that they're sure that the food will be purchased and be eaten during a time that it's at its best, right? So that is an area I do think where CEA can offer, outside of COVID, a benefit to food waste, or to limiting food waste.
Thank you, Marnie, for those examples. Lauren, you know, what do you think? I mean, from a policy perspective, is CEA seen as a meaningful solution to food waste, which is an enormous environmental and economic issue?
Well, this conversation is making me think about one example from Medellin, Colombia, which I think is really interesting and instructive right now. So just to pick up on a couple of themes that I'm seeing in the Q&A, themes around sort of the city region food system, does CEA replace, agriculture as we know it, also circular economy stuff. So I think food waste fits into all of this, and CEA, of course, is part of like a broader ecosystem of food production and supply in these regions, right? So just building on that, in Medellin, I mean, they've really been thinking about food policy for a long time. And so in a sense, they were able to mitigate some of the issues that Nana described in her 3 examples, because instead of sort of closing down and locking down these huertos de abastecimiento that they have, supply farms that are, you know, supported by the city government to bring food into the city from all different kinds of producers. Those were really acknowledged right from the outset as essential services. Their movement and flow of goods was enabled and encouraged. And then, you know, because of the sort of disruptions in supply chains, we saw, like Nana also said, you know, new digital e-commerce like WhatsApp exchange, like all these kind of creative new ways of sharing information and making sure that food that was available was getting to the right spot. So, you know, a lot of this innovation, I think, that we're seeing to manage food waste is about social innovation, right? It's about having that social capacity and those social assets that allow you to kind of be really adaptive. And that stands in real contrast to other supply chains, like in the US, where millions of animals have been euthanized, you know, at a time, because of the processing plant shutdowns, the abattoir shutdowns, at a time when food banks are being overwhelmed by demand. So, you know, it's just like this kind of contrasting ability to shift, and agility versus fragility in supply chains, durable supply chains which kind of last through these crises versus like really fixed supply chains that just can't, you know, repack their flour from those big flour bins to meet the growing demand of like home baking, for example. Or so, you know, just like thinking about durability versus, you know, these fixed supply chains that can't adapt.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that paradox in this. And I guess I want to answer one of the audience questions that kind of relates to that really briefly from each of you. What do you think? You know, we've talked about COVID-19 being a wake-up call. Is it really a wake-up call? I mean, we had SARS, we had MERS, we've had other issues in the past. Is this really different? Are we really going to learn from this, do you think?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I sure hope so. And of course, you know, we're seeing like so much information, so you can be on, you know, one side of the coin or the other. Yes, we are going to change, and no, we're not. But, you know, recently, for example, China decided that they're not going to report out on GDP. And for me, this is like a really interesting sign that we're looking for new metrics, new holistic metrics to evaluate success and sustainability and resilience in our broader economic systems. And then of course, we're translating it here into food. So, you know, what do those new metrics look like? They address labor, they address food safety, they address food security, and they address kind of our broader sustainability agenda. So I'm seeing signs of hope there.
Marnie, any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, quickly, I would just echo everything that Lauren just said. And also just from the United States perspective, it feels like, I feel hopeful that we're at a real turning point here. We've got a lot going on in this country right now that we are coming to a head on. And I think it feels different than any moment in American history in the last, I would say, 50, 60 years. And so while I acknowledge that that's not everything, I do think that we are in a position to really take this in and make a change. I sure hope, to echo Lauren, I sure hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those crises, you know, they did spread globally, but they didn't lead to a global shutdown of, you know, billions of people being at home. So I think that are some distinct differences. Nana, anything to add briefly?
I was just about to say what you said. So
okay.
I think this is different. Yeah.
I'll give you credit for that then. With the great minds think alike. So let's move into critical topic number 3, which is food security. First off, I want to kind of echo some of Lauren's definition in her introduction about what food security is. So food security means that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, talking about food safety, nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs from an active and healthy life. So really a perfect scenario for food access and quality and their preferences as well. So our question to you, the audience, that we're going to have in a poll is what is the biggest advantage that controlled environment agriculture, CEA, offers in the realm of food security? And you can see some options there on what the benefits are from CEA to food security, and we want to hear from you what those are. And then we're going to dive into some questions with Lauren and our other panelists. So give you a few more minutes to answer that. I want to remind you that you continue to send us questions. We are going to do our best to get to them. We're going to have a question and answer period at the end as well. So please keep them coming anyway. So let's wrap up the poll and see what people think before we move into this question. Okay, so the top answer by a fraction was year-round production. Okay, so the ability for these controlled environments to produce year-round, followed by a shared response from less food miles, so fresher food, and less exposure to natural disasters. Honestly, it looks like here, people pretty much feel like CEA has a full range of possible impacts pretty equally across the board. So that's interesting that people see benefits of CEA in multiple different areas. So again, that makes me think about, what is the right CEA solution for the right location and the problem you're trying to solve specifically. Is the problem climate? Is that the major one? Is the problem food safety, food waste? Is that the major one? So let's move on to you, Lauren. So obviously COVID, as we talked about, has made food security more vulnerable, at least shown those flaws in our system as we've talked about. What are you seeing governments doing to respond to this issue, the specific issue of food security, and some of the things maybe that we haven't mentioned already? Are you seeing a dramatic shift in policy? I mean, you mentioned some of them, but can you illuminate us on some more of those?
Yeah, I think I'll start with just offering a couple of some general reflections on how governments are kind of acting around food, maybe differently from the way they would have otherwise, and then try to also link to our conversation about CEA and the kind of implications of this for CEA. So, overall, I think my observation is that governments at various levels, whether it's at municipal level that we were talking about, the local level or the national level, so those governments who have already addressed food in an integrated way were able to address food security issues that arose from this pandemic much faster than those who were not. So it's just a reminder that we actually need to do that work of, cross-silo connections, intersectoral kind of dialogue in order to solve these problems. And if you've done it before, you have the relationships and networks to, do it in a crisis. So that's kind of one observation. And then, of course, there have been a number of responses around the emergency food access, which has really been critical, I think, for all governments to deal with. So the increased demand for emergency food services. So for example, in Toronto, where I'm from, the libraries have been opened for food banks, to create additional food banks. Toronto is giving grocery gift cards to families who are enrolled in student nutrition programs. So those kids would have otherwise had breakfast or meal programs in schools. In the US, the Good Food Purchasing Program has really quickly pivoted as well to redirect institutional food programs around the country. Food Share, a local NGO, has really just scaled up the delivery of fresh fruit and vegetable boxes to the most vulnerable neighborhoods, who are also the neighborhoods who are most impacted by COVID, right? It's those communities that are racialized, who are poorest and most vulnerable, who are also seeing the highest rates of COVID in our city. And then other networks like the Toronto Food Policy Council advocating for opening of community gardens and farmers markets where they were initially closed. So really doing that advocacy work. So that's sort of part of the short-term recovery. Similarly in Quito in Ecuador, that's done a lot of work on that sort of city region. They're really looking to improve the operation of their wholesale markets and their retail distributions in this time, making sure that those small shops that are providing food stay open, trying to control price and speculation and kind of all those economic waves, et cetera, et cetera. So, and also doing a ton of work around kind of food safety, bioprotection for everybody involved in the food system. So those are kind of the shorter term measures. And then there's the sort of longer term implications around building back better and using this moment to think about building resilience and not kind of entrenching this charitable food response. So I think this is where we get into the opportunity for CEA, because a lot of people right now, policymakers, are thinking about significantly enhanced funding for green, nature-based infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, circular economy. And I think we're going to see a kind of sea change where food is increasingly recognized, instead of just the sort of a private business, as public infrastructure that requires the same investment strategies as public transportation, affordable housing, clean water, energy, et cetera. So like, what does it look like to have this public infrastructure, and see, CEA as part of that public infrastructure? So the associated zoning and planning regulations that enable this, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to kind of make that point. Like, really, CEA and this kind of regional agriculture needs mid-sized infrastructure for processing and distribution, and to encourage kind of flexibility and agility in the system. So I think that's the opportunity moving forward. Just to mention, like, specifically the implications, I think, for CEA. I think CEA businesses, and all of you who are working in those businesses and as investing in these systems, need to think about the broader connection to this infrastructure and to the city region food system, to kind of be engaged in those broader discussions. Think about the multiple dimensions of food security that CEA is connected to. And also think about how CEA contributes to social resilience by reducing vulnerability. And really, a lot of that is about living wage, as we've seen, excellent benefits, sick leave, social protection, good HR policy. Like, those are things that can be done at the business level. Making sure that there are strong diversity and inclusion strategies. These are all protections that more accurately reflect the importance of kind of local and regional food economies and their ability to adapt in times of crisis.
Thank you, Lauren. I mean, so much there. I really liked the comment on infrastructure, and I'm going to actually ask some questions, if you can answer them quickly, from the audience related to this. So to follow up with you, one of the questions is, emergency charity funds are being used, to feed people, but why doesn't that money go towards infrastructure? I think in some ways, the response in the US to police versus funding education is kind of an interesting thing as well. What's the infrastructure of safety versus responding to safety issues? So are governments talking about that? Are they seeing investing in this infrastructure you mentioned as a new response, or response that they should do instead of aid?
I think there's a lot of discussion about that right now. And the good news is, from where I stand in Canada, is that emergency food distribution, the emergency food distribution sector has been thinking for a long time about, how not to become more entrenched, how not to become more reliant on, private and philanthropic donations to address food needs. And some of the economic measures, the economic support that's being given to individuals is demonstrating that, if we had that kind of economic foundation for people from the outset, that maybe some of this kind of charitable response wouldn't be so heightened and so kind of drastic at this moment. So what is the floor for an annual income? What do people really need to take care of their basic needs like food? So we don't need to have these acute levels of hunger and the skyrocketing demand for charitable food distribution.
Very interesting. Nana, you had some thoughts on policy you wanted to share. Do you want to share some thoughts on that related to food security briefly?
Yeah, so with regards to Ghana, there have been some mitigation measures by the government of Ghana. So we have what we call National Board, NBSSI, so National Board of Small Scale Industries. And so the government is giving stimulus loans to local businesses to support them, to cushion them because of COVID-19. And also we've also seen that the government has given tax flexibility by the Ghana Revenue Authority. And we also have some tax deductibles just to support local businesses, small, medium businesses, so that they don't collapse after COVID-19. So these are some of the things the government is doing to support businesses in terms of the pandemic. Yeah.
Great. So we want to thank the audience for going through these 3 critical topics for us and the panelists for exploring them. Let's open it up to some audience questions. Gus, if you want to join, I could use your help in filtering through these questions and answering them as well. I just want to make a comment first that a lot of the questions are around the technical feasibility of vertical farming. There are some questions on policy. So if you have technical questions about this, I definitely invite you to check out GreenTech's equipment marketplace, which has a lot of information, and keep in touch with the GreenTech newsletter for equipment and also some of their announcements. FarmTech Society is a go-to place for policy as it relates to CEA. And if you are looking to design a farm, as I mentioned earlier, Agritecture Designer gives you some of those economic estimates. So there are some resources there. We're going to select some questions that we think are going to be good here. Gus, do you have any that are on mind? I have one, which is, I'd like to ask anyone on this line right now, consumer preferences, how will they change post-COVID-19? Anyone can jump in.
Well, here in the U.S., we've seen a number of studies that, it's probably a little too soon to tell, but a number of studies that indicate that consumers are turning towards what they perceive to be healthier foods, fruits and vegetables. Consumers are obviously cooking more at home. For those consumers who had a lifestyle that included a healthy dose of restaurant going, that is all gone, and folks are focusing on cooking at home more, at least until that becomes available again. And so I think, we also hear a lot, we all know that COVID is not transmitted by food. And we also hear a lot of consumers saying, we're really thinking about food safety here. We want to think about safety with regard to everything, right? And so we're thinking, in the US, we see people, sanitizing everything that comes into their home, right? And so the more I think that we can communicate the efforts that we take in our production to ensure that our food is safe and healthy, the more we will sort of meet some of those consumer demands that existed pre-COVID, but I think are broader now.
Right. Yeah, maybe I can add a few sentences as well. Is what you are seeing is, of course, that as Marnie also points out, is that people are staying more at home. Therefore, they're more or less forced to have to cook for themselves more. But also, I think enjoying maybe the joys of cooking and making a good meal. And I think also that a lot of people are putting the money that they otherwise would be spending in restaurants into a better quality of food that they buy for themselves. This is very much also the case in the example that you mentioned for Urban Harvest in Brussels, who actually are thriving because they can offer a superior quality of vegetables through the retail channels to their consumers. And the other thing, I also believe that the interest in food security, food safety is very, very high. And of course, vertical farming guarantees a way that is essentially free of added chemicals. You don't need to wash, you have excellent shelf life. You're pretty sure that you get something that you're very, very happy to eat and feed also to your family. So I do see a lot of opportunity there. Obviously, we also as an industry still need to work on making sure that we develop this into a feasible option for many, many people, because right now vertical farming still is something for the high end of the market, I would say.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I was going to jump in if that's okay. Do we have time, Henry? Just
yes,
on
we do. I will tell you when we're out of time. You have time.
Okay, great. I think it's a really interesting question, and of course, even before we came into this COVID reality, we were really seeing dramatic global shifts in consumption patterns. So with, some countries really eating more meat and other countries, eating less meat or less and better meat, and all of these kind of interesting dynamics that are really mainly driven actually by the sustainability agenda, by climate change concerns, all of these things. So I think it's interesting to kind of think about, this moment in relationship to those broader trends. This morning I was on a webinar that was hosted by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development with Edelman, and they were talking a lot about trust in the system. So Marnie, just to kind of build on your points, you know, how are people expressing that desire and that interest in more trust in the food that they're eating, in the brands that they're connecting to? And then finally, I think really we've seen in COVID, like a lot of new patterns for purchasing food. And I think CEA has been well poised to kind of walk through the door of some of those new behaviors. Like Nana was talking about, you know, more like digital platforms for, you know, buying food and home delivery, and, you know, the list goes on, right? Like I think we've all kind of changed some of those patterns, and whether we just go back to the way we're purchased and made food before, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how long-term some of those shifts are.
So we got a question here from Iris, and this question really is, I'll just read it out. How does CEA address food poverty? And I think many more people globally are moving into poverty as a result of COVID-19. When the majority of vertical farms are loss-making due to excessive costs, obviously vertical farms have more infrastructure, more lighting. Food doesn't have to be more expensive. Food shouldn't be more expensive, I think, is the opinion of Iris. And I guess I just want to kind of just highlight that a little bit, that we talked about the infrastructure needed. Most of our respondents to the poll said there are various benefits of CEA, from year-round production, this or that. I mean, CEA operators typically don't get subsidized in the same way that other types of agriculture do. You know, I guess what's the path forward for CEA to impact the food insecure? Any thoughts on that? Is it possible with such a high upfront cost? Is there a government role in that?
Maybe it's a good time for me to step in there for a few
Please.
pointers. First of all, having come also in the innovation we're looking at in farming here is also driven by technology, and we're seeing that we bring new systems to the market that are not always as mature yet as the existing ways of growing, and there is a learning curve and a technology development curve which will improve. So we're seeing that the systems that are being constructed today are a lot better than what we did 5 years ago, and that will continue to go on for a while. Now, this is not like computer chips where these things will be free for after a while, but at least you can make quite a lot of good improvements there still. On the other hand, the question is, of course, can vertical farming be a viable way of providing food for most people, for the masses, I would say, and not just for the privileged? And that is something that will happen over time. I'm sure it will happen. It will not happen for every type of food. It will be limited to the same type of crops that you're growing in greenhouses today. But over time, you will see that vertical farming can be a very viable alternative, also because we can reshape the value chain. We can make food fresher, we can make it better, we can make it healthier and more nutritious, and more available to those people that are in the middle of an urban area where they normally cannot get fresh food. And I think those benefits are the ones that we need to build on as an industry. And that's also why we need to work on standards and education and policy making to make sure that we also create the playing field, if you will, for this industry to be successful. And that's also where your point comes in for subsidies and everything else, Henry.
Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to another question. We're going to try to answer as many of them as possible. So this question relates to the kind of common question of, will CEA be able to grow staple crops? CEA typically grows some of the leafy green products we mentioned, and obviously a lot of the costs to that are going to be very expensive with these high-tech systems. Agritecture estimates that bread sold from a vertical farm may cost, you know, $17 a loaf, for example. Will COVID-19 change that? Will COVID-19 accelerate the diversification of crops in CEA? Maybe that's a Gus question too. Any thought? Maybe Marnie, do you have a thought on that? I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? That's a tough one.
I had my turn.
Marnie, you might want to jump in here, and Anna too, but you know, from my perspective, it's not sort of either or, right? It's, again, we talked about the sort of city region food system and ecosystem of, you know, producers and suppliers, and CEA fits into that where it makes sense. So I'm not sure you're going to grow the corn soy rotation in a CEA environment or, you know, context. So anyways, I don't think I need to say a lot more than that, but obviously you pick your crops, and we need to think about the cost of food really broadly. Like, what are those broader costs? We're not going to, you know, embed costs that don't make sense.
Yeah, they're tools in the toolbox.
For frivolous reasons.
Methods of production, and CEA doesn't solve all of them. It solves some of them for some of the crop categories.
That's
Marnie,
right.
do you have some additional thoughts on that?
Right. I mean, I would echo what Lauren said and just say, it's a both and situation, right? It's a big tent of a variety of ways that we can solve a variety of problems in our food system, right? We don't have one problem in our food system. We have a number, and we don't have one solution. We sure shouldn't have one solution. And so CEA will continue, I believe, to grow and adapt in the areas where it makes sense. And I think there are going to be other solutions out there that also together with CEA can solve some of these problems and shift our food system from where it is to something better, and then yet better again as we continue.
Thank you so much.
To add to what Lauren and Manny said, so I mean, CEA can't solve all the problems, but I believe that we all can also be part of the solution. So why not start growing what you eat at home? Yeah. So COVID-19 has taught us that you can actually grow your own food. We spent time at home, and so you can grow your own food. I have initiated a program in Ghana called Home Gardening with a She Farmer, where I teach people how to grow their own foods at home. So we can all be part of the solution. You can grow your own food if you can. All right. So let's try to think outside the box and to be part of a solution.
Thank you so much, Nana. That to me sounded like a call to action, which is what I want from all the panelists as a last bit. So I'm going to count that as yours in the interest of time. Lauren and Marnie, and then Gus, really quickly, what's one message you have for the audience to wrap things up as briefly as possible?
Just to echo what I've said already, I think the call to action is really about thinking creatively about resilience in the system, social, human, and environmental resilience. So this won't be the only shock that our system faces in the future. Mm-hmm. And how can we learn from this experience to better prepare ourselves for the future?
Thank you.
Well, Lauren, you took mine, but so I will just add on that, yes, I agree, resilience is the key. The other thing that I think you raised earlier that I just think is a really critical call to action is this thinking about CEA in the context of infrastructure, and thinking about building a more secure food supply, building the infrastructure to allow for a more secure food supply, and making sure that CEA is a part of that conversation. I think that's critical. It's something we're working on here in the US because I think without it, we're kind of playing what we call whack-a-mole, trying to solve problems as they come up, as opposed to creating the right infrastructure so that we can be resilient to these problems going forward.
Thank you. Gus?
Well, there's not much to add there. In the end, what we're looking for is to provide good and healthy food to as many people as possible, and to make and to help make the world a little bit better place that way. It's not about technology. It's not about putting nifty tricks that you can do. It is really about how do we make sure that we can feed these people in many, many different places. And the way that this goes here, we start probably at the top with a relatively expensive solution, and we get better over time. And I think we need to pull together and work together and make that happen.
And my message to our mostly European and producer-focused audience is focus on your customer as much as possible, even if you're a CA operator far away from them. I think COVID-19 has shown us that those that have a strong, close relationship directly with the customer, whether it's through social media, through newsletters, through various aspects of them visiting your farm virtually or in person, has been able to really strengthen their ability to adapt to this and sell to them directly, which is a bit important. So think about that.
So Henry, that wasn't my call to action.
Oh, go ahead, Nana. Go ahead, Nana.
So for me, I think we've all seen the lapse in our food systems. So my call to action is for us to build solid collaboration to strengthen the system, which is for me the most it's important to build solid collaboration so that we can really strengthen the food system. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nana, Lauren, Marnie, Gus, all of our panelists and moderators today. I'd like to leave the final thoughts to our incredible host for GreenTech, Mariska Dreschler. Mariska?
Thank you, Henry. Well, we genuinely hope that this webinar was of inspiration to you and provides you usable new insights as horticulture professional. We are very eager to learn how we can shape the webinars to your wishes. And so please don't forget to send your evaluation points in the survey that will be sent to you. Well, thanks FarmTech Society, Agritecture, and the panelists for your contribution to this GreenTech talk. Also, thanks to you, audience, for your contribution, because you had a lot of questions in the Q&A, and we will do our utmost to answer them later on. Well, together we are the GreenTech community. Bye-bye from the Rise Studio in Amsterdam. Stay safe and healthy.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.